We are going to do the planner is in today, the free for all. So hopefully you have a bunch of questions for our illustrious speakers. And our speakers today is Tara E. Bamford. She is a community planning consultant. Tara has been providing guidance to New Hampshire communities on a wide range of planning topics for over 30 years. Her consulting services focus on assistance to planning boards with master plans, zoning amendments, site plan and subdivision review regulations, and their application review process and administrative procedures. So thank you for volunteering for us today, Tara. Also joining us today is Mark Fougier. He is a certified planner of Fougier Planning and Development. He is the president of Fougier Planning and Development, and he has a planner with over 29 years of both public and private sector experience. He has managed numerous rewrites and amendments to zoning ordinances and site plan and subdivision regulations. He has an extensive background in project management, dealing with a broad array of planning-related issues, including spearheading rezoning efforts, managing development teams, site and land use planning, fiscal impact analysis, public presentations, and expert witness testimony relating to land use law analysis and consensus building challenges. So again, thank you, Mark, for volunteering with us today. And of course, again, doing double duty is Ross Maldoff, the planning director for the town of Salem. So we welcome again back Ross. So we are going to wrap up the conference today. It is close to noon. We're shooting for noon as best we can, so the rest of you can enjoy your day and get ready for the Derby. And our speakers have agreed to answer questions relating to this session after the conference if we run out of time. So we are here for our free-for-all. The planner is now in. So if you have questions, we can track them in the chat for you, and we will go from there. So let me see.
We do have one person with their hand raised if you'd like me to unmute them. I think it's our first question. So
sure, absolutely. Please, welcome.
Yep, perfect. So Nelson Disco, I'm gonna you are able to unmute yourself now and ask your question.
Okay, can you hear me?
We can.
Yes, we can.
Okay. I was having trouble with Ross's presentation because the slides weren't showing on my screen. All I was getting was a screen with the pictures of Ross himself. Did I do something wrong, or is there a way to connect in?
I'm not sure. Are you seeing our current slide that says today's speakers?
Yes.
Okay, so I guess the best I can do, unfortunately, at this point is just recommend we do post all the slides have been posted, and this recording will be posted in the next couple days. So while you did hear everything, I encourage you to go to the web, our OPD conference page website and check out those slides afterwards as well. So
okay,
but my apologies for your technical difficulties this morning.
Okay, thank you very much. That's a big help. I also would like to get in touch with Catherine Nelson. If I could get her email address or something, I have some questions for her pertaining to floodplain use. It's a little off the subject here, but I would like to talk to her.
Okay, I can put that's me. I can put my email in the chat, but if not, Nelson, I can reach out to you directly because we have your email from when you registered, so I can do that this week. So.
Is this Catherine I'm talking to?
Yes, it is. Yes,
oh,
it is.
Great. I'd love to talk to you again. We have passed.
Yep. Okay, perfect. Sounds good. I'll put that in the chat and we'll move on if we have, other questions, but we'll touch base next week, Nelson. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for your patience and understanding, everyone, as we all are kind of aware when we are pivoting to this virtual meetings and trainings, we do have some glitches that unfortunately seem to happen, reoccurring, but we do our best. And again, we keep talking about it, but if anyone has any missing any information or any of the other seeing slides at some point, but then not, we do have them available on our website page. So we thank you very much for your patience. So if we have any questions here, we can start off with a few roundtable discussion questions. Maybe that'll trigger some questions for the chat. So here's a question for the panel, and any one of you can jump in at any time. The question is, will commercial development lower our taxes in town?
I get asked that all the time in Salem, and the answer is classic. It depends, because depending on where you are, commercial development can actually have an impact on town services. If you end up having a large development, but you have to add more police and fire, and there's going to be more traffic, and you need a traffic signal or something, it can actually have a negative effect. But I think almost always when you see, and Mark does the fiscal impact studies, and almost all of the ones that I've seen show a positive fiscal impact, positive tax impact from commercial development, that they pay more in taxes than what they demand in services. But that does not mean that your taxes are going to go down, because the tax rate is set basically by decisions that are made by other people, the selectmen and the budget committee and the town meeting about spending. So it's not a simple answer to the question, and I don't think it's always true one way or the other.
I'll just follow up with Ross. I agree with what he said. Is generally speaking, it's positive, but it depends. Some commercial uses generate few service demands, while others generate a lot. I mean, a big retail development could generate a lot of police calls, for example, and we've seen that in our analysis that we've done. But it also goes back to spending, right? I mean, taxes are based on local spending patterns. If the local spending increases every year or greatly, any additional revenues seen by the community are going to be offset by those increased costs. So it's a complicated question. All things being equal, if you didn't increase any costs in the community and things were locked in, you may see a decrease in the tax rate if services don't need to go up a lot. So as Ross said, it's not a simple equation.
Okay, thank you. So in using your experience, what are some suggestions that you can give for how planning boards or municipalities can enforce compliance with approved site plans and subdivisions?
Such a common concern. One of the things that I've tried to do, because I do a lot of updating of regulations, is build a list of possible conditions right into the regulations for starters, so that the planning board has almost a checklist of possible conditions to put on a site plan or subdivision approval, and then write a very detailed notice of decision that is clear about what the threshold is for different steps, what has to be done before it's signed, what has to be done before work can begin, what has to be done before it has building permit or certificate of occupancy if they have one. Because I've run into, especially with a lot of small towns without full-time planning and zoning staff, the planning board does the approval and then on it goes, and it has its building permit the next day without any of the conditions being met. So I've started just being what might look like over detailed in that, because I think that's the first step to making sure that things are enforced.
I'd add as-built site plans. We talked about this in the last session, and outside inspections have been big helps here. And it doesn't have to be necessarily a large project, but even a small project, I think, would benefit from that. Outside inspections to make sure they're doing what they say they were going to do, and as-built site plans at the end of the process prior to occupancy to make sure that they built what they said they were going to do.
I would concur with both Tara and Ross. Obviously, follow up during construction is key. The plans approved with conditions and everything that's on that plan, the builder is responsible for. So obviously making sure that's done along the way. Obviously every community is different as far as availability of staffing, but remember that boards have the ability to hire outside consultants if you're a smaller town to help you with that. The town engineer, your engineer or engineering consultant can be hired to make sure everything's done properly. If the local building inspector or the planning department doesn't have that capacity. So obviously, you know, a lot of promises are made during the planning board approval process, and it's important to make sure that gets closed at the end, that they do everything they promise to do and the plan matches reality. So I think we have a couple questions too, Stephanie.
Yeah, just one other thing to add to that. While most communities seem to know that they can do a performance bond or letter of credit, one thing that I find a lot of planning boards aren't aware of is that they can also ask for inspection fees to be escrowed. And I think having that account in front of the town is a reminder in itself that, you know, that there is money there to hire somebody to look at the plans and look at the final product, and that's an often missed step.
Yeah, I would agree, and add to that, it's something that, you know, maybe not a lot of planning boards are aware of, that it's at their, you know, their ability to, is what Mark just kind of talked about it, and Ben talked about it this morning as well, and us as planners, that we utilize, you know, as much as we can, is that third party review. And the crucial point of that third party review is that it's the applicant that pays for that. So then you have the town's ability to have someone acting on their interest for protection and for enforcement issues, but it's paid for at the applicant. So there's that differential there, that I don't want planning boards to be afraid of saying, oh my gosh, we have to hire an engineer. Yes, you should be hiring an engineer, and the law provides for that to be paid for by the applicant. And one other thing I would just kind of wanted to follow up with that question about how to enforce compliance. What do you guys do as planners to maybe outline that process? So you've seen a violation. What is the town's next step? Is it notifying in writing? Does work have to stop? Or how do you follow through with that once a violation has been identified?
Well, it really depends on the type of violation, but it would not be unusual for us to send a letter and to either call or go visit the site where the violation has taken place and tell them, make sure they knew, in addition to sending a letter to document it, that something had to change. Unfortunately, the process gets a little bit more difficult after that step, because we can tell anybody that they're in violation or they've got to stop work. And if they don't stop work, or if they don't resolve the violation, we can't go out and simply fine them ourselves. Typically, we have to take them to court. And the same thing with most communities, I'm assuming, is there's not a lot of time and there's not a lot of money to go through that process. So it's basically violation notice, letters, visits, and cajoling them to try to resolve the violation.
I mean, I think a lot of communities have some leverage, you know, that development's looking for a certificate of occupancy. You can work with the building inspector to, you know, threaten to hold that CO up. But I agree with Ross, going out and talking to the site supervisor or who's ever in charge directly. I've always found to be a positive step, obviously following up with a letter so it's written and documented, as Ross said, but visiting the site saying, listen, you know, these things were supposed to be done and we don't see them either started or you know, you're going to open up next week and this whole landscaping area is not done. What's going on with that? And try to get ahead of it. If things are missed, then and a CO is issued, then obviously it gets a little stickier and you're going to have to go after them. I've found most development companies don't want to mix it up with the community. Obviously, you could get a bad apple where you have to go to court, but hopefully you never have to go down that vein, because it's, as Ross said, it can be very challenging when you try to start finding people.
I wanted to add too, in response to I see in the chat, isn't the Board of Selectmen the actual enforcer? That's the comment I wanted to make as well, that in many, especially small towns, there's a disconnect between the planning board and select board, and sometimes confusion over what role lands where. And my advice to towns is always what Ross outlined, where you start with a letter from the planner or planning board, or planning staff. Give them every opportunity to bring things in compliance before turning it over to the select board. And then in many cases, the select board, they're responsible for the town budget, so naturally they're going to be reluctant to drive, run up lawyers' fees and court costs. So more you can do to ward it off in the beginning of the process, the better.
Okay, thank you. A question from the chat. If a subdivision was approved several years ago and the planning board placed off-site improvement conditions, but did not bond the work, what is the responsibility of a new owner developing the lots?
Well, to me, that's a fairly straightforward one. If it was part of the approval, he owns it. That person, that new company owns the approval, and hopefully, that offsite improvement's detailed in the approval documents. It's detailed on the plan. And, when you take over a project, you take over everything and all its responsibilities and all the conditions associated with it. Just because a new owner owns the property, or owns the development package, doesn't, to me, is irrelevant. That they're buying the package. And that's obviously, to go back to Tara's point, when you approve a project, make sure that there's appropriate conditions and details in there. Any offsite improvements should have been fleshed out and detailed as part of the package of approvals with detailed plans, et cetera. But to me, the new owner, it would be irrelevant, period.
Okay, so another kind of roundtable question. How can we encourage cooperation between the planning board and the zoning board, as many communities are faced, or sometimes there's, as Tara likes to say, the disconnect between those boards? So what are some of your thoughts and recommendations for how we can get cooperation between the boards?
I think if anybody can figure that out, they should write a book. I think they do very well.
Right.
No, we've tried meetings, joint meetings before, just to talk about not so much projects, but goals or zoning amendments. Sometimes we'll talk about. We've had a joint meeting regarding ethics so that everybody could all be in the room together to hear that. But I think generally they see themselves as very different in their authorizations, and typically they don't like the other's decisions.
Yeah, I guess I would agree with Ross. It's oftentimes it's oil and water, and you can shake it up, but it separates after a while. I think having joint meetings to chat about goals and things, I think that is important, for the people to meet and actually talk to each other. I think that does help. We often invite the ZBA to make any recommendations on zoning changes if they've come across issues during the year that they think need to be addressed, and I found that to be a useful exercise. But there seems to be always this edge between the two groups that's often difficult to bring them together.
Yeah, and I think, which is really great, Mark, to bring up the point with, talking about zoning amendments. And part of that, I think, is, do both boards really understand each other's, independent roles? You know, when a ZBA is reviewing an application for a special exception, there are specific criteria that the ZBA needs to address in the special exception criteria, and sometimes they want to veer into site plan issues, which is the planning board's purview. So, I mean, I think it's really important for both boards to understand their respective roles. And again, you know, zoning amendment time, when boards should be, you know, maybe starting to think about zoning amendments in the late summer or fall. Maybe it is a conversation, like Mark said, to build on that, is to reach out to the ZBA and say, hey, have you noticed a lot of variances? Have you noticed a lot of issues? You know, do we need to change some wording? I think that really would kind of help build the bridge and help those boards understand their roles and how they should be cooperating through the land use process.
I agree. That's always, to me, a first step with reviewing a zoning ordinance, is to look at the ZBA minutes and ask for input from the ZBA. What language are they having trouble interpreting is something you see, as well as, well, if you're giving a variance to this all the time, my answer is just get it out of the zoning. But I've had a lot of success with having the boards have joint meetings when a project needs a special exception and site plan review. And usually, even though those are hosted by the planning board, I think it makes a lot of sense to have the ZBA have their hearing and their conversation first, and that drives some things that the planning board might think about as conditions of approval in the site plan. As you said, Stephanie, it's a different role, but there is overlap in when you come to the conditions. So I've found that works pretty well.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the first things we do when we get hired to go into a community and evaluate their zoning is we look at, as Tara said, we look at the ZBA filings and where there have been a lot of requests for either special exceptions or variances. And if we see a trend in a particular area, we'll bring that up to the community and say, listen, why are there so many people asking for setback variances? You know, maybe in the downtown area, you know, you're trying to apply a setback that's really a rural area standard. You know, especially if you have small lots. So maybe this is an adjustment we ought to make or what have you. And it's always a good glimpse to see what's going on as far as potential issues with the ordinance.
Yeah, very good. Thank you. Ross, did you have something to add to that as well? Is it something in your experience with the larger town? Okay. Okay. So, question from the chat. How do you revoke an old subdivision approval, circa the 1980s, which was never completed, when parts are now owned by multiple parties?
Ooh, wow.
That'll wake you up, right? For a good question.
Hard to do. We've never done anything like that in Salem, so.
Yeah, that's a tough one. I think you really need to speak to your town council on that. That sounds like a very complicated program to unravel, especially that old, and multiple parties. Yeah, that's a legal counsel, I think. Very challenging and unfortunate, obviously.
Yeah. Okay, so for roundtable question, do we really have to allow adult businesses in order to regulate them?
Oh, boy.
Third rail topic. Yeah.
That happened in Salem. That exact issue happened in Salem. We had no restrictions, and we're faced with an adult bookstore that came into town. Funny story. They at some point they were in front of the planning board, and there were a lot of protesters and signs, and the guys came up to me, the owners, and said they feared that they were going to be physically assaulted, and they asked me to call and get them police protection at the meeting. That's about the only time that's ever happened. So, but we found out from our attorney that if you don't have any regulations, you can't restrict where they're going in. They're selling a product. It's a legal product. and you can't tell them that they can't come in because you don't like the product. So we found that we actually had to adopt regulations. And try explaining that to the people at town meeting. By the way, we're gonna adopt these regulations, some of which I didn't even want to read or say publicly, but we're going to have to adopt these regulations so that we can prevent these types of things from coming in. That wasn't an easy task. I think the police chief handled that part of it. But.
Yeah, I concur with Ross. The same thing happened with myself in the city of Nashua. We got an application for a bar that was at different stages. Obviously the mayor got involved. It got very, very touchy. Luckily, in that particular case, the applicant withdrew after the attorney withdrew his support for the project, and the building owner became aware of it and pulled the application, wouldn't sign off on it. But it's one of those things, if you don't regulate it, and I agree with Ross, just coming up with a regulation can make people blush. But that's, you need details and you have to be very specific. But if you don't adopt that type of regulation, they can go anywhere because they're basically a retail store or a bar, a restaurant. It's sometimes a very difficult topic to discuss, to bring up, to advocate at town meeting or in front of a city council. But that's what you got to do. And otherwise, it can go anywhere, as Ross said. So.
Yeah, and that's kind of, what some of the things, just to kind of reiterate things about zoning amendments and things like that. I mean, two really important parts of your zoning ordinance are definitions and your table of permitted uses. And zoning is the tool that legally allows communities to say where places can locate. So, to be proactive instead of reactive, would you rather have an adult business right in downtown, or would you like it maybe a little bit on the outskirts where it's not so plain in your face? So to make sure that the boards and the municipalities know that they do have the authority to do that. We can say where you can locate and still be legally correct.
Well, it's a planning board, right? So it's to your point, Stephanie, you're supposed to plan, and it's always better to plan for uses than be reactive. As Ross and I both had to go through, we had to react, and that's always very challenging. You end up rushing, and when you rush ordinances and regulations, usually you're not doing a good job, because it's you're trying to, we had to generate an ordinance in a week in the city, and that's never fun.
Right.
So plan ahead.
Right.
But I think this conversation summed up the issue around short-term rentals in a lot of towns too. I often get asked to help write short-term rental regulations, and I look at their zoning and say, but your zoning doesn't allow them yet. So let's back up and put that definition, as you said, Stephanie, the important piece being the definitions, get that in the zoning. So the select board are adopting regulations for something that the zoning ordinance clearly allows.
Right. And to touch on, definitions and to touch on the short-term rental topic, that's how the Portsmouth case was decided by the New Hampshire Supreme Court, was based on that definition. And in Tara's neck of the woods, I don't know if we've all seen or been following the Dalton situation, where that town was running into issues with their zoning as far as a new dump location. So again, it's a good example of communities scrambling and being reactive, instead of, yes, it takes time and there's volunteers and boards only meet once a month. All of those kinds of things play a role, but when you're more proactive, you're really saving a lot of heartache and money and time down the road to be able to deal with these situations that can come up. So we have a question in the chat. Can you address ADUs, specifically tiny homes And how have your respected towns dealt with them?
So I think the answer has to be in two parts of whether they're on foundations or wheels. Because the state building code now addresses tiny homes on foundations, and if you allow a detached accessory dwelling unit, then it doesn't matter if you call it a tiny home or whatnot. I've tried to write into zoning ordinances the codes. There are now codes that apply to tiny homes on wheels that are more like RV safety codes dealing with electrical and the fuel storage. I think that's really where you need to get your arms around it, is with the safety. So if you allow an RV, you're allowing a tiny home on wheels if it meets the same safety codes. And I guess I don't have any, none of the 8 communities that I work regularly with allow an RV to be an accessory dwelling unit. So they also would not allow a tiny home on wheels.
Yeah, I think the tiny home thing is, I've always, looked at it as a residential housing unit. So the size of it never really enters into my thought process. It's still a residential unit. If they're going to be living there year round, become a resident of the community, it's a housing unit. So as Tara said, in our state, accessory dwelling units are required by statute to be allowed in every community. So you need to address those in your zoning ordinance. You don't have to allow detached ADUs. Many communities do, but that should be addressed in your regulations. If a community prohibits detached ADUs, then a tiny home, or any home for that matter, wouldn't be allowed. And there's a number of different ways to address detached ADUs. A lot of communities have maximum size areas or minimal lot areas if you're going to have a detached ADU. But I think that needs to be dealt with in your zoning ordinance on how you want to deal with that detached unit. And that would go the same as yurts. I just saw another post. So
Yeah.
it's still a dwelling unit. A dwelling unit is a dwelling unit. It can come in many shapes and forms. If you live there year round,
I'm not going to claim that the building codes are my area of expertise, but I'm not aware of any yurts that would be able to meet the building codes. And I think the safety is really what the focus should be on.
And just as a follow-up thought to one of the questions, I mean, the attendee, brought up the point that with the housing crisis the way it is, utilizing ADUs for affordable housing, is beneficial. And maybe just another tool in our toolbox as we're trying to figure this out. And Mark can also kind of comment on that, of the affordable housing things. But I think that was kind of the intention, one of the intentions of when the ADU RSAs were drafted, to kind of see if we could help ease this crunch of this housing crisis.
Well, I think the more options a community has, or more options people have for housing, it's good. I mean, ADUs, obviously, a lot of people use them for in-laws or something like that, but they can be rented out, obviously, to people. And, the owner's going to charge the maximum rent that they can achieve based on the local market. So it may not necessarily be affordable, but it's definitely another housing option that I think has a very little impact on municipalities. And as we stated, it's required anyway in every community. But I don't have a problem with detached ADUs. I think that's a nice option to have, and it's up to each community to decide, what that looks like.
So how would you guys, as planners in different communities and sizes and regions, how do you handle controversial projects with the public?
I think the first step is making sure that the planning board stays focused on the regulations, on what the substance of the regulations really is, has them in front of them during the meeting, and that conveys that message to the public that these are the parameters that need to be looked at. I've had, working in small towns, I don't run into big crowds a lot, but on one project that I did, the planning board have people sign up about what they wanted to talk about and sign up by the piece of the regulations. One of my sort of pet peeves is I hate to see public hearings organized by for and against, because it's not an election or a popularity contest.
Right.
I want to see it organized by the specifications and standards in the regulations. And I think that when the public sees that, they are more comfortable that the planning board did their due diligence.
We've used outside reviews in a variety of topics. If the neighbors are concerned about drainage, we have an outside engineering review. If they're concerned about traffic, we have an outside traffic review. A cell tower came in just off a residential neighborhood, and we had an outside attorney working with the planning board and outside experts reviewing various aspects of the plan. They still weren't happy, by the way, but that allowed the planning board to move forward with the projects, typically with the expert opinions addressing those things. And it's not easy, and each one is different because there are different issues that the neighbors may have or that the community may have with a project. But that's how we've done it.
I would agree. I think a lot of, abutters that show up at meetings, especially very controversial meetings, feel that, because the room is packed with people against it, that the board can vote it down because the majority of the abutters or all the abutters are against it. I mean, that's not how it works. We have specific state rules, statutes here in New Hampshire that dictate what the board can do. Obviously, there's local zoning, subdivision, site plan regulations that the boards have to follow and follow their regulations. And, everybody can be against the project, and the board may have to approve it if it meets the regulations. And the same way, if everyone in the room was in favor of it, if the project didn't meet regulations, the board could deny it. Obviously, if you deny a plan, many cases it's going to be appealed to Superior Court or to the Housing Appeals Board, et cetera. So you really need to do your homework and make sure you're citing specific requirements that aren't being met if you're going to deny a plan. But it's obviously it's very challenging for board members to sit in the meeting with their neighbors and friends arguing against the project in front of them. And, it's not a popularity contest. Unfortunately, it's very, very driven by regulations and ordinances.
Right. Right. And we touched a little bit about that this morning with Ben in the earlier session about, you're there to make the tough decisions, and you're there to do a public service, for the community. As well as, we talked about the boards following their rules or procedure, which is another way for a chair to really kind of set the tone, for the meeting. This is how we operate. This is the process that we use. So, a lot of misinformation and bits and pieces that swirl outside the meeting can inflame people and board members. So it's a good practice pointer to make sure that you're following the regulations, you're following your rules of procedure. Your chair has the ability to control and run things as smooth as possible. Right. Go ahead, Ross.
One other tool that we've used is we've recommended to applicants that they hold a neighborhood meeting in advance of coming to the planning board. A lot of times when people come to the planning board, when they get the notice in the mail, for example, they don't know what's going on. And that they're kind of upset about that. And so if an applicant can either meet with them in advance or at least let them know what's going on, go talk to them. A lot of times with a controversial project, that helps, especially with the direct neighbors.
I agree with that 100%.
Just for clarification, we had a question in the chat. Whatever became of the law the state legislature was trying to pass regarding all towns to allow detached ADUs? And he not sure of the specific bill, but does any of you had any clarification on that?
I don't remember a bill this year that dealt with that.
Mhm.
There was a Senate bill that was going to basically prohibit towns from regulating Airbnbs this year. That was in the Senate. It got out of the Senate and went to the House, and I think the House recommended killing it, the last I had heard.
Mhm.
So if that had passed, towns would be prohibited, which is one of the few things the state ever gets involved with in prohibiting or getting involved with a specific use. It was a ridiculous bill, but
Right.
that had to do with Airbnbs and rentals. But I don't recall, I don't know if Ross or Tara does, I don't recall the ADU thing.
No, I don't. But the current ADU law allows the town to have that option, correct?
Yes.
For clarity,
Yes.
right?
Yep.
Okay, that the
Yep.
town can choose whether or not to allow detached or not.
And they don't have to. They
Right.
have to allow ADUs, but they don't have to allow detached. So it's up to every community to decide if they want detached ADUs or not.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you, Mark, for that clarification. So how would you guys handle or advise your boards that an applicant is going to threaten a lawsuit if the planning board does not approve their project? It's board intimidation.
My answer to that is the exact same answer I gave to the last question. Is I try to keep the planning board focused on what the regulations actually say, what the zoning says, and as nearly as possible, our blinders on to that threat.
I agree with that. I mean, it's an intimidation factor. I mean, I was in a meeting this past month, and the applicant brought 2 lawyers because having one wasn't enough. And I don't know what message they were trying to send, but you know, you follow the rules, you follow the regulations, and your statutes and the zoning, and you do the best job you can, and let the chips fall. Definitely do not get intimidated by that type of tactic. And just ignore it, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. Good advice is to make sure that, you know, the boards, you know, when in doubt, if you're feeling like maybe you're going down a road where you could be falling into a lawsuit or, you know, concerned about your decision, you have the ability to continue the application, talk with town council,
Exactly.
talk with your experts. I mean, there's, you know, one thing that I like to feel as though that we can teach and empower our boards to not, you know, fall victim to the threatening of the lawsuit, because that it's not fair to the board, to the town, to the applicant, to you know, all the parties involved. The planning board can take a breath and continue and get proper advice and move forward. And again, back to those kind of rules of procedure and having a chair that can, you know, the chair and the board that can, you know, navigate through these bumps, because we're all aware of them. We've all been in meetings when it's happened. So that the planning boards have that protection, and you're allowed to take a break and regroup.
I mean, the boards are required, once an application is accepted, to approve it or disapprove it in 65 days. And, you know, for very big projects, complicated projects, often that isn't enough time. So obviously you need to work with the applicant to have them agree to an extension of that time. The board needs information so they can make an informed decision. And if the applicant refuses to extend that review period, then the board has to make a decision on the application. And if you don't have all the facts in front of you, if consultants haven't gotten back to you with their comments on different phases of the development, or, you know, traffic or drainage or what have you, then the board can deny it because you're not ready to make a decision. And they can't force your hand because they have a timeline that's unrealistic.
Right. And exactly. And to, empowering to, boards to not be afraid to deny and specify those reasons, so that, the board is protected and not making a poor decision. So that's good, Mark. Thank you. So jump into the chat here. Some of the questions are stacking up. So as a panel, can you discuss the ins and outs and pitfalls of rural elderly housing developments?
Well, I guess that, over 55 housing, I guess I'll qualify it at that, because there's obviously different types of elderly housing, but it has its pros and cons. It's generally tax positive because it's, there's no school age children that typically are allowed there, assuming the regulation requires both occupants to be age 55 or older. That's an important provision that you should look at in your regulations if you're going to go down that path. Obviously there are, it's not a free situation. There are increased costs, and typically that is in fire and ambulance calls. So you should obviously consider that in your decision making. Probably, for that type of use, that's probably the biggest impact on the municipality. On the EMS side, you are going to get increased calls on that type of use. So obviously working with your fire department to make sure that that type of activity they're going to be able to handle it, is probably the biggest measurable metric you can look at as far as concerns.
We had a lot of senior housing developments in Salem when we have, and I think we made a mistake in allowing a very large density bonus in return for, excuse me, in return for applicants doing senior housing. And ultimately, we felt that that was not the right move, and we eliminated the density bonus and haven't had a lot of projects. I will tell you there's tremendous demand for the what we call senior housing. People buy the lots, buy the homes. We've allowed a variety of different types where it's all one lot, or and condo units, but that are very close together. And we've allowed individual lots, and we've also allowed multifamily style buildings. Almost always, those have been in locations that are not rural. In fact, the planning board has not allowed, there's some discretion in the zoning ordinance about where they allow them. And they've said, hey, put those on water and sewer locations. And I imagine you could make that decision as to where you want to allow those types of developments. But tremendous demand. And I don't think we found that the type of development we were getting was what we wanted, and we ultimately eliminated the density bonus.
I'm a little stuck on the word rural and wonder what Steve is thinking and how rural, because I work in primarily rural communities, and they don't have public transit, so or other services that you would really want with a senior housing specific development, as opposed to encouraging things like ADUs and smaller homes and whatnot that might be more suitable for someone in a rural community to be able to downsize to.
Right, that's a really good point, Tara, regarding services. And again, it can kind of pivot back to your definitions and your table of permitted uses and where you're going to allow that. Because if you have an elderly, development way on the outskirts of town, services, community services for that, for those residents, as well as emergency services for those residents can be, can strain the municipality. Let's take a break from the chat here. I see maybe, Katie, do we have someone on the phone, or is that just a hand raise?
We do have a hand raised. We have Deborah Johnson. I'll allow you to, you're now able to unmute yourself and ask your question. And the unmute button should be up in kind of the right-hand corner near the leave button. Okay, I guess we're not hearing from Deborah, so maybe we'll move to the next chat question and just
Okay.
give her a second to see if
Okay.
she's looking for the mute button or the unmute button.
Okay, yes, thank you. Okay, what do you recommend when the applicant requests that the board make a list of very specific findings of fact and findings of law?
I would not recommend that the planning board create a document that they don't normally have. I want to see those things covered in the minutes and the notice of decision, but I would be wary of responding to that with the document they're requesting. It wouldn't be an official document like the minutes or the notice of decision.
Yeah, I mean, typically, those findings are typically seen in a ZBA decision versus a planning board decision.
Right.
And I always be wary of applicants asking for that type of thing. I agree with Tara. You follow your normal procedure. I mean, I see that as a ZBA thing that you follow when you make a decision. Whatever your procedure is for approval of the criteria of the ZBA, that's how you follow it, and you submit your decision as you normally do. I wouldn't go out of the way to change your procedure. And if someone asks for that for a planning board, planning boards typically, unless there's a conditional use permit, aren't addressing findings of fact. At least that's not been my experience.
Okay. Open space calculations. In your observations, do most towns allow wetland areas and so HSG 5 and 6 soils to be included?
I've seen towns pretty evenly split on that, depending on what their goals are for the open space subdivision. If the goal is just to protect some contiguous areas of important natural resources, then they would normally allow it. And you know, it's pretty common for a community to want you to show a calculation of how many units you'd have under a standard subdivision first, and then the same regulations would apply of whether you're counting the poorly drained soils and wetlands or not. It wouldn't usually be different than the zoning for the underlying regulations.
Yeah, I agree with Tara. I mean, typically in open space or a cluster ordinances, the goal is you don't take away density. You're basically saying that, you know, you're allowed 10 lots and you can shrink it down from 2-acre lots to 1 acre or 3/4 acre lots and have open space. So you prove out your density based on a standard, you know, design, and then you can consolidate. If you're trying to write a different type of ordinance, then, you know, most of the time I've seen is those wetland areas and steep slope areas are taken out of the calculation if you're doing a gross calculation. You know, gross area, then you want to net. You take out steep slopes, you take out wetland areas, take out floodplains and other things that may not be buildable. But typically in an open space, it would be, you know, the same density would apply.
We've done open space subdivisions for about 30 years here in Salem. We probably have 20, 25 of them. There's maybe 2 I would point to as good. Most of the rest of them, they're using the open space is primarily the wetlands and a little bit of land around the wetlands, where it's unbuildable. And many times it's in the back of the house lots, which you can't see as you drive down the street. So the density is higher. or even if it's the same number of homes, it looks like a more congested subdivision because everything's closer together. The houses are all closer together, and they're cutting down all the trees, and we make them plant, 2-inch caliper street trees along the street, but it's just not the same. Whereas if you have a normal subdivision with regular lot sizes, you can typically save some of the trees on the side lot lines and sometimes in front. But we require 50% of the land to be reserved as open space, and we require 50% of that to be non-wetland. But you'd really be surprised, even with those calculations or those requirements, we still get a lot of what I would consider to be very poorly done open space subdivisions, where the open space is mostly wetland and the land surrounding the wetland that wouldn't be developed otherwise.
We have a follow-up comment. I think maybe it was in reference to the pitfalls of rural development for elderly housing. Just the comment was, we're a town of 3,500 without those amenities, and we are looking at independent living. So hopefully some of your concerns were answered by the panel with that discussion for the elderly housing. So, Katie, are we able to take the person on the phone yet, or is it?
I believe she put her question in the chat.
Oh, okay, perfect. Thank you.
Yeah.
Is there anyone else waiting on the phone?
Nope, that's it.
Okay, very good. Okay, so here we go. Okay, so Deborah's question. Here we go. Thank you. If your town has no building regulations, does that mean that the town has to adhere to the state code?
Yep.
We're getting a unanimous.
Yes.
Very good. Thank you. So if the planning board likes a project, but it doesn't meet the regulations, can we still approve it?
It depends whether it's the zoning ordinance it doesn't meet or not. If it doesn't meet the zoning ordinance, the planning board can't approve it. If it doesn't meet the site plan and subdivision regulations, and it's clearly something that meets the vision and goals of the community, then they can waive the regulations. I think if a zoning ordinance is not allowing things that meet the vision and goals of the community, then the zoning ordinance is too rigid and too specific and doesn't allow the right amount of flexibility.
I think the practical answer is they can do whatever the heck they want to do, especially if they don't get caught. But I mean, by the way, we've written our recent zoning ordinances have allowed the planning board to waive aspects of them so that for special districts and things, so that the applicant doesn't have to go to the zoning board, and that the whole thing can be handled by the planning board, and the applicants really appreciate that. But the cost of that is that sometimes you get applicants who are asking for waivers when you really don't think they should be granted. But my experience is the planning board can, and they have done things. They're not supposed to approve anything that is contrary to the zoning, but they can come up with various interpretations of the zoning ordinance, especially if it's not a specific dimensional standard, if it's more qualitative. We had an ordinance that said office buildings in one district had to resemble the appearance of older houses. And, they looked at a building and said that I didn't think came close to meeting that standard, but they looked at it and they said they thought it was okay and they approved it. So I guess it kind of depends.
Yeah, so as kind of a follow-up to that theme, so what does the board do when someone appeals their decision? What's that first step? What are they looking at?
I mean, that can be an appeal of many different aspects, because to Ross's point, if the planning board makes a zoning interpretation in their decision, that's appealable to the ZBA. If they're not getting involved in that, then there's an appeal directly to Superior Court. If it's a housing related matter, an applicant has the ability to apply appeal to the Housing Board of Appeals, which is a new agency that began a couple of years ago. And then it's off to the races. I mean, they are hearing cases fairly quickly at the Housing Board of Appeals, usually within 3 to 4 months, and making decisions within 6 months approximately. Court cases are going to take much longer. You're going to be racking up the legal fees in either way, which obviously can impact budgets. And either party, they don't like the decision, could end up in front of the Supreme Court. So it can be a long, drawn out affair.
And what happens to so I'm an applicant, I came in, my decision was appealed, but what happens to the application itself? Can it continue moving forward, or if once an appeal is filed, what happens?
Well, if you're an applicant and say an abutter has appealed your decision, you can't go forward. Typically, that would be a stay in the proceedings. But again, that's all subject to legal counsel, and but typically the applicants can't go forward with a project that is subject to an appeal, a Superior Court appeal or Supreme Court appeal. We've had that situation in Salem a couple of times, and sometimes the applicant will say, "Hey, I want my building permit anyway," and we say, "Hey, it's at your own risk." But sometimes the court will order an injunction and prohibit the town from issuing a permit or going further in the process. But typically, it puts the project on hold.
Yep.
Okay. Does the applicant have to be referred to the ZBA by the planning board, or can they go directly to the ZBA? I think that may be related to the appeal question. So does an applicant have to be referred to the ZBA by the planning board, or can they go directly to the ZBA?
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
If we're not talking about the appeal, they can go to boards in any order they want.
Yeah, I guess it depends. I'm a little confused by the question because it depends, right? I mean, if the use isn't allowed, then the first step, they have to go to the ZBA. Typically, an abutter or an aggrieved party is concerned with the planning board making a zoning determination. So that party will appeal the decision of the planning board to the ZBA because they made a zoning determination. They made a determination that the house, as Ross's point, met the conditions of the ordinance, that it had to look this way, and I disagree. And they made a zoning determination in their review of this project. So it's typically not the applicant going to the ZBA unless there's something in the regulation that requires them to do that.
Or in the approval. Or
Yes.
in the approval. I mean, I've also had projects that the planning board's supportive of and wants to approve, but there may be some detail that doesn't meet the zoning, and the expectation is that the zoning board is probably going to grant the variance to the setback or whatnot. So it might be approved conditional on zoning board approval.
Mm-hmm.
If a project, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead, please, Ross.
If a project needs a variance and they're coming in front of the planning board and they need planning board approval too, we will typically say to them, go to the zoning board first, because if you come to the planning board and you don't have your variance, we're kind of wasting our time if you don't get the variance. So go get the variance first and then come to the planning board.
Yeah, I would agree, Ross. I think that's kind of a great old school kind of thing. I used to tell my boards, that the ZBA is like your permission slip. So if you are going to the planning board to put a drugstore, in a zone it's not allowed, you're kind of you're kind of wasting time and money and effort to go to the planning board for site plan approval when you don't have your permission slip first. So yes, the planning board can approve something conditionally upon getting a variance, but that's a big rub for an applicant to do. So it's been, just kind of like I would agree with Ross, is that if there's an application that needs a variance prior to site plan, I think it's a better use of resources and time to get that permission slip first and then go to the planning board with that approval already. A chat question here. Do you have any examples of innovative land use controls that are truly remarkable or surprising to share?
I've always been amazed at the work over in Dover. They have some very innovative zoning. Obviously, they have a strong urban core, sewer and water. But the work that Chris has done over there is very, very innovative, I believe, cutting edge. I mean, they have a transfer development rights provision in their industrial zone where I think it's for every 10,000 square feet of building area, you can get a housing unit, which you can then either build in the industrial zone or sell to somebody to build in a receiving area. I mean, it's just interesting, obviously very sophisticated. You need to have staff that can work with that. But in my applying the waters in the state, that's one area, that's one community I've always seen as being remarkable, to David's point.
Yeah, I would agree. I'd have to also jump on that Dover bandwagon for looking for innovative, successful, and out of the box, cutting edge, innovative land use controls. Oh, go ahead, Ross.
Well, I just wanted to bring up two things. We've done some interesting things with environmental protection in terms of innovative. We've in the standard model floodplain ordinance that most people adopt allows development in floodplains, and in Salem we've gone beyond that. We had some bad flooding problems a decade and a half ago, and so we have prohibited new development in the floodplain, and we've required compensatory storage at 2 times the rate of the encroachment of fill in floodplains. So you can't build a new structure in a floodplain now, and but you can put some fill in. But if you put fill in the floodplain, you have to provide twice the amount of compensatory storage. We've done some things with our wetlands ordinance where we've and prime wetlands and enacted buffers around prime wetlands of 100 feet, natural undisturbed vegetation. But the other thing I just want to talk about is we've got this massive development in Salem called Tuscan Village, and it's really almost another community in itself. Just as the scale, we're talking about 3 or 4 million square feet of commercial industrial space, and probably 1,500 dwelling units when we're done, and all sorts of very interesting things. But we adopted a zoning ordinance that to allow something like that, and basically we threw out the zoning ordinance, and it still remains to be seen whether this was a good idea or not. But we basically said, meet these general criteria, come in with a conceptual plan that shows us that you meet the criteria, and you can really do what you want. There's no limit on number of units or setbacks, or the planning board can waive everything. And as I say, it's produced a lot of development. Whether everybody's going to look back on it and say that's a good thing or not, I'm not sure. We'll see. Time will tell. But that's something else that we've done that's kind of innovative.
We actually did the same thing in Greenland, in the northern part of town, to help try to leverage sewer and water utilities in that area of the community. And it's basically, you know, as Ross said, it's wide open. It's an overlay district. Anything's allowed. No density requirement, no height requirement. It's basically, you know, what do you want to do? And it's up to this planning board. You know, there's very strict criteria that has to be met. So it's not, you know, free for all, but nothing's come in yet. But, you know, they're hoping for something, obviously.
Great, thank you. Those are great examples that people can go to those communities and check out those regulations. We have, Katie, is there someone on the phone or another hand raised to use the phone?
There is. Deborah Johnson has, her hand is raised. So Deborah, I will allow you to unmute yourself. I've been told there's also the unmute option might be at the bottom of your screen, not the top, just depending on which version of Teams you're using. But if you'd like to unmute yourself, allow your mic, you can ask your question.
Yes, can you hear me?
Oh,
Yes.
yes, there you are, Deborah. Thank you.
All right, I started to type it in, but I'll just ask it outright. We're a very rural town in Groton. About 600 people live here. We successfully passed the zoning ordinance, and everyone's still getting used to that new zoning ordinance passed this past March. However, we're faced with numerous applications regarding ADUs and Airbnbs. And my specific question with regard to that is, can the planning board during site review possibly require septic versus an outhouse or a incineration toilet? And can we require hookup to well water versus getting it from the stream?
Yes, you certainly can require compliance with the state's regulations for those things. I mean, that's pretty standard in your regulations. Should be approval from Department of Environmental Services.
Yeah, I think the ADU law, I'm kind of cold medicine, foggy brain here, but I think the ADU law does require that there's a separate septic hookup. So like
it requires adequate water and sewage, but it doesn't say specifically a septic hookup or a well water hookup. And people are trying to get around that by saying, well, you know, you can still have an outhouse in New Hampshire. So why should we have to hook up to a septic system?
It is specific in the ADU statute that they need to be able to show that they can expand the DES approved septic system to accommodate the ADU.
How about an Airbnb?
Well, an Airbnb is, you know, I guess it depends on your ordinance if it's even allowed. I mean, I look at them as, you know, a hotel room, be it in someone's house or what have you. So many zoning ordinances state that if it's not allowed, if it's not specifically noted in the ordinance, it's not allowed. So I guess that would be the first question.
Okay.
Yeah, and also I think, you know, just it's kind of like, you know, people get, you know, confused, you know, about condominiums coming to my neighborhood. But condominiums is just the form of ownership. It's still a dwelling unit.
Yep.
So, you know, Airbnb is a tag that we put on something, but when push comes to shove, it's still a dwelling unit. They still have to adhere to, you know, health, safety kinds of things. So, you know, I know people like to kind of go down that road, but in reality, just because you're calling something an Airbnb doesn't erase the fact that it's still a dwelling unit, and still needs to adhere to things. So hopefully that was helpful.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks.
You're welcome. So we're coming on, we have about 5 more minutes. It's if the panel would like to maybe take one more roundtable question or give anyone a chance in the chat to see if anything should pop up.
Sure.
Okay, let's do one more chat question and see if we can get it done in 5 minutes. So as the planning board or as the chair, can you control public comments? Maybe kind of, you know, these controversial hearings, meaning can you limit the length of time that people speak? Can you open up a meeting and say, hey, we're only going to really accept, you know, one comment over the same thing? Or how can, you know, a board kind of control the chaos if there's a lot of comments about the same issue?
I think that's really up to your policy. You know, typically, I'm used to, we give abutters, you know, 3 minutes to speak, especially if it's a large development with lots of people, so everyone gets an opportunity to speak. And then we'll allow secondary comments after that. You know, when you have a very controversial development and there's a lot of people in the room, if you allow unlimited time to people, you're going to exclude some others from able to speak, and your meeting's going to go on for a very extended period of time, which may occur no matter what you do. But setting up some sort of rules of procedure is probably the best place to do it in the planning board's rule of procedure on how to address public meetings, so that everyone gets to get their point across. And, you know, obviously repeating the same thing isn't helpful for extended periods of time. You want to try to get everyone's opinion as best you can. That's what I've seen.
Yeah.
One piece of how you phrased that, you would not want to limit the number of people speaking on the same issue. I think you said that as well. And you certainly could limit the amount of time to a reasonable amount of time, but you wouldn't be able to tell somebody, no, you can't talk about that because someone already did. Everybody has the right to have their input.
Yep, I agree.
Right.
I'm not a big fan of limiting the time, and I understand the issue, but I think, you know, 3 minutes or 5 minutes, what's the right amount of time? And if somebody has something important to say, I don't know. We've never done that, but we have had the chairs of various boards say, hey, we've got a lot of people here and we have other things on the agenda. And so if you could please be brief with your comments and please don't repeat what somebody else has said. And sometimes they have to say that a couple of times. And sometimes they tell someone, thank you very much for your comments. Can we move on to the next person? But it's really up to, and you need a strong chair, obviously, to do something like that. But I'm not a big fan of limiting the amount of time that people get to speak, especially if they have something to say. The whole purpose of the meeting, really, in a way, isn't it, is to get public input. That's a critical aspect of it, if that's not the whole purpose. But so I'm not comfortable with the idea of restricting that somehow.
Yep, those are good points, Ross. And as well, you know, also if things are getting repetitive or you know, the offer can be made that people can always submit their comments in writing, and it will become, you know, part of the official record. So all good points to try and control the chaos.
Or continue to another night. I mean, the relationship with the public is pretty important.
Yeah.
And you need to allow ample time. And if you know it's gonna take a while, have it be the only agenda item and have an extra meeting.
Yep, that's also a good point as well, Tara. If you have a special meeting, public hearing just for that application, so that everyone can feel to be heard, and other items don't get bumped off an agenda if you run out of time for a certain item.
I've seen that many times. That's a good point, Tara.
Yeah, yep. We did have one quick thing come in from the chat, maybe just as a follow-up. Many towns don't allow detached ADUs. How can someone get a tiny house to use as an Airbnb?
Well, that's going to be dependent on the local town. you know?
Yeah, yeah.
Apply
Again,
for a
if you're allowing
variance and
Airbnbs, that kind of
Yeah,
thing. Back to your
variance.
definitions.
Yeah, if it's not allowed, it's not allowed. So, I mean, a tiny home, I know it's a great little term that people use, but to Stephanie's point, it's a housing unit. So it doesn't matter if it's tiny or 3,000 square feet. A housing unit is a housing unit. You can call it whatever you want. You're living there year round, it's a housing unit. And if it's not year round, it's a, it's a mobile home or a RV. So it's,
Okay, well, thank you very much. Again, great discussion. And I want to, again, appreciate Tara and Ross and Mark again for your time, for your teaching styles, for your candor, your longevity in the planning community is much appreciated. And we hope you have continued longevity to help us with this. We truly appreciate your expertise and your advice. And all of it for posterity reasons. The session has been recorded. So please, if you've missed a portion or think that someone else would benefit from this, all of our conference sessions are going to be available on our website. And please, once again, as noted in the slides, and also you can find on the website that we are having a survey of our conference. So please, all feedback is appreciated. It is anonymous. So again, thank you very much, everyone, for your time and your attention and your questions. And we'll let you go enjoy your Saturday.